Under the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, a family endures sleepless nights on damp concrete. Across the Atlantic, a PhD professor roams the streets of Los Angeles in search of food. In Paris, the city of light, individuals live along the Seine's banks, surrounded by waste. This is not a fictional tale, it's the harsh reality. Homelessness is surging across some of the richest nations, from the United States to France, the UK to South Korea. What led to this crisis? Why are millions in billion-dollar economies losing the roofs over their heads? Let's delve into the causes behind this escalating issue. The UK, unprecedented levels of homelessness. Despite its economic strength, the UK faces a severe homelessness crisis. In 2023, over 10,510 individuals were reported homeless, with more than 1 in 200 households experiencing unstable living conditions. London, a global financial hub, has the highest homelessness rate in the country, where 1 in 58 people lack stable housing. Rising property prices and stagnant wages have widened the affordability gap, making even modest accommodations unattainable for many. Indigenous communities and housing inequality. Indigenous Canadians face disproportionately high homelessness rates due to systemic barriers, intergenerational trauma, and inadequate social services. Though making up only 5% of the population, they account for nearly 30% of the homeless in major cities. Overcrowded and substandard housing on First Nations reserves worsens the crisis. The role of nonprofit organizations. With government support falling short, nonprofits like Raising the Roof and the Salvation Army provide emergency shelters, transitional housing, and job training programs. However, demand exceeds available resources, leaving many without help. The United States, a superpower with a severe crisis. Despite its economic power, the U.S. faces one of the most severe homelessness crises in the world, affecting both urban and rural areas. Economic inequality, mental health challenges, and a lack of affordable housing contribute to the issue. In 2024, over 582,000 Americans experienced homelessness, with 77,400 classified as chronically homeless. Major cities and housing costs. Cities like Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco highlight the crisis, where entire streets are lined with makeshift shelters. Skyrocketing rents have worsened the problem, with the national median rent reaching $2,530 in 2024. In San Francisco, a one-bedroom apartment exceeds $3,000 per month, making housing unaffordable for many. Mental health and addiction challenges. A 2024 report found that 25% of unsheltered individuals suffer from severe mental illnesses, while 38% struggle with substance use disorders. The lack of affordable health care and the closure of mental health facilities have left many without essential support, making homelessness a persistent issue. Nonprofit organizations and local efforts. With government programs falling short, nonprofits like the Salvation Army provide emergency shelters, job training, and transitional housing. However, demand for these services far exceeds available resources. France, a harsh reality behind Paris's glamour. France's growing homelessness crisis. Despite its global reputation for culture and luxury, France faces a worsening homelessness crisis, with an estimated 333,000 people affected, nearly double the number a decade ago. Major cities like Paris are particularly impacted, where 16.1% of residents live below the poverty line on an average of $800 per month. Rising housing costs, stagnant wages, and economic disparities have forced thousands into unstable living conditions. The squatting issue. A unique aspect of France's crisis is squatting, individuals occupying vacant properties due to unaffordable housing. French laws provide squatters with strong legal protections, often sparking conflicts with landlords. Government efforts to tighten anti-squatting laws have been met with criticism, as they fail to address the root causes of homelessness. Asia, economic growth hides a worsening problem. Despite rapid urban development, Asia faces a growing homelessness crisis. Rising real estate prices, economic inequality, and limited social safety nets have left millions struggling for stable housing. In major cities, the cost of living has surged beyond the reach of many working-class citizens, while restrictive housing policies and cultural stigmas further worsen the issue. China, industrial growth, and hidden homelessness. China's rapid urbanization has lifted millions from poverty, yet homelessness remains a critical issue, affecting around 2.5 million people. In cities like Beijing and Shanghai, skyrocketing housing prices leave low-income workers unable to afford shelter. Migrant workers, restricted by the hukou system, are particularly vulnerable. Hong Kong, with some of the world's highest real estate prices, has seen a rise in McRefugees, homeless individuals sleeping in 24-hour fast food chains. Many others are forced into coffin homes, tiny, windowless living spaces barely large enough to lie down in. South Korea, a hidden struggle. Despite being an economic powerhouse, South Korea has around 11,000 homeless individuals, many of whom are elderly and unemployed. In Seoul, the Jeon's rental system requires large deposits, making housing unattainable for low-income citizens. Many seek refuge in subway stations during brutal winters. Government-funded programs and nonprofits, such as Dream City Center and Myeongdong Church, provide meals, shelter, and employment training. However, cultural stigmas around homelessness often discourage individuals from seeking help, highlighting the need for broader policy reforms. Canada, the struggles of harsh winters and housing insecurity. Homelessness in Canada affects approximately 235,000 people annually, with over 35,000 lacking shelter on any given night. Urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver face the worst of the crisis, driven by soaring rents and a shortage of affordable housing. In Toronto, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment now exceeds $2,500 per month, making stable housing unattainable for many low-income individuals. Indigenous communities and housing inequality. Indigenous Canadians experience homelessness at disproportionately high rates due to systemic barriers, intergenerational trauma, and inadequate social services. Despite making up only 5% of the population, they represent nearly 30% of the homeless in major cities. Many First Nations reserves also suffer from overcrowded and substandard housing. The role of nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits like Raising the Roof and the Salvation Army provide emergency shelters, transitional housing, and job training programs. However, demand for these services far exceeds available resources, leaving many without necessary support. Government initiatives and challenges. The federal government's National Housing Strategy aims to build 100,000 affordable housing units by 2030. However, critics argue that these efforts are insufficient, as waiting lists for social housing remain long and emergency shelters are overwhelmed. Rental market speculation and foreign investment have further driven up costs, increasing eviction risks. Without stronger tenant protections and greater investment in affordable housing, the homelessness crisis is likely to persist. Australia and New Zealand, a Pacific perspective. Indigenous communities and housing inequality. Indigenous Australians and Canadians face high rates of homelessness due to systemic barriers, intergenerational trauma, and inadequate social services. In Canada, Indigenous people, despite comprising 5% of the population, account for nearly 30% of the homeless in major cities. Many First Nations reserves also struggle with overcrowded substandard housing. In Australia, Indigenous Australians represent 20% of the homeless population, though they make up only 3.2% of the total. The role of nonprofit organizations. With government efforts falling short, nonprofit organizations like Raising the Roof and the Salvation Army provide emergency shelters, transitional housing, and job training. However, the demand for these services far exceeds available resources. Moving towards sustainable solutions. Experts emphasize that tackling homelessness requires substantial investment in affordable housing, stronger tenant protections, and expanded mental health and addiction services. Without these measures, the crisis will persist. In New Zealand, nearly 50,000 people experience severe housing deprivation, often living in garages or overcrowded dwellings. While the government's Kanga Ora initiative aims to expand public housing, demand continues to outstrip supply. Germany, a strong welfare state, yet a rising crisis. Germany reports around 650,000 homeless individuals, with rent increases of up to 40% over the past decade. While the government has pledged to construct 400,000 housing units annually, many continue to struggle. Indigenous communities and housing inequality. Indigenous Germans experience homelessness at a disproportionately high rate, often due to systemic barriers, intergenerational trauma, and a lack of adequate social services. Despite making up only 5% of the population, Indigenous people represent nearly 30% of the homeless population in major cities. Many First Nations reserves also suffer from overcrowded and substandard housing, compounding the crisis. The role of nonprofit organizations. In the face of government shortcomings, nonprofit organizations and local advocacy groups have stepped up to provide critical support. Organizations such as Raising the Roof and the Salvation Army offer emergency shelters, transitional housing, and job training programs to help individuals reintegrate into society. However, the demand for these services continues to exceed available resources. Moving toward sustainable solutions. Experts argue that a long-term solution to Germany's homelessness crisis must include significant investment in affordable housing, stronger tenant protections, and mental health and addiction support services. Without these measures, the cycle of homelessness is likely to persist, affecting more individuals each year. Klaus, a retired factory worker, became homeless after his pension couldn't cover rising rent costs. Meanwhile, refugee families endure years-long waits for stable housing, placing further strain on social services. Homelessness is a persistent issue that spans across both developed and emerging economies. Despite efforts from governments and nonprofits, the crisis continues to grow. How do you think this issue should be addressed? Share your perspective in the comments below.